Henry Courtenay mounted the scaffold charged with the most ironic crime in English history, possessing royal blood purer than the king himself. What should have been his shield was actually a death warrant signed the moment he was born. He didn't perish for treason. He died because his very existence was a threat to the shaky Tudor crown. Betrayed by his own cousin and childhood friend, Henry VIII, Courtenay was the ultimate sacrifice on the altar of paranoia. The old royal dynasty, the House of York, had been decimated. However, it was not destroyed. The Yorkist line carried a prestige that the Tudors desperately lacked. This is where Henry Courtenay enters the historical record. He was born around 1496, though some records suggest 1498. He was the son of William Courtenay, the Earl of Devon, and Princess Catherine of York. While his father's lineage was ancient and noble, it was his maternal line that defined his destiny. Princess Catherine of York was royalty in the truest sense. She was the daughter of King Edward IV. She was the sister of the princes in the Tower, the young King Edward V, and Richard, Duke of York, who vanished mysteriously in 1483. Most importantly for this story, she was the sister of Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth of York was the mother of King Henry VIII. This made Henry Courtenay and Henry VIII first cousins. They shared the same grandfather, King Edward IV. In a political landscape where lineage was power, Courtenay possessed what historians often term dynastic lethality. If the Tudor line failed, if Henry VIII died without a male heir, the crown would not necessarily pass smoothly to his daughters. Many in England, particularly the conservative nobility in the north and west, looked to the old blood. They looked to Henry Courtenay. He was the heir presumptive in the shadows. For the first half of his life, this proximity to the throne brought him immense privilege. Eventually, it would mark him for destruction. Henry Courtenay's life did not begin in splendor. It began under a cloud of suspicion. His father, William Courtenay, was a premier nobleman of Devon, but he had fallen afoul of the first Tudor king, Henry VII. Henry VII was a deeply suspicious man. He spent his reign looking over his shoulder for Yorkist pretenders. In 1504, William Courtenay was accused of conspiracy. He was allegedly involved with Edmund de la Pole, a Yorkist claimant who was plotting against the king. The evidence was murky, but for Henry VII, suspicion was enough. William was attainted. This was a legal mechanism that stripped a noble of his titles, his lands, and his civil rights. The vast Courtenay estates in the West Country were seized by the crown. William was thrown into the Tower of London. Young Henry Courtenay, then a small child, was left in a precarious position. His mother, Princess Catherine, remained free due to her status as the Queen's sister, but the family was disgraced. They were financially crippled and politically isolated. Henry Courtenay spent his earliest years watching his family suffer for the crime of having the wrong friends and the wrong blood. However, the wheel of fortune turned in 1509. The old king, Henry VII, died. His son ascended the throne as King Henry VIII. The accession of Henry VIII marked a dramatic shift in the atmosphere of the English court. Henry VII had been a miserly, paranoid bureaucrat who ruled through fear. Henry VIII was 18 years old, athletic, handsome, and eager to be loved. He wished to turn the page on his father's grim reign. He wanted to restore the glamour of the monarchy. One of Henry VIII's first acts was to liberate the prisoners of his father's paranoia. He released William Courtenay from the Tower. Although William died shortly after his release, succumbing to pleurisy in 1511, the young king's goodwill transferred to the son. Henry VIII looked at Henry Courtenay and saw a mirror of himself. They were roughly the same age. They were cousins. They had both been raised in the orbit of the royal nursery. The king wanted to surround himself with his own blood. He wanted to restore the ancient nobility that his father had suppressed. In 1512, the king made his move. Parliament, at the king's direction, reversed the attainder against the Courtenay family. The young Henry Courtenay was formally restored to his father's title. He became the Earl of Devon. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a massive transfer of power. The Courtenays were the uncrowned kings of the West Country. They controlled vast swathes of land in Devon and Cornwall. Their tenants were practically a private army. By restoring these lands to his cousin, Henry VIII was placing enormous trust in him. For the next decade, Henry Courtenay lived a life of extraordinary privilege. He became a fixture in the king's inner circle. The court of young Henry VIII was a place of ceaseless activity. It was a world of jousts, hunts, masks, and gambling. Courtenay excelled in this environment. Contemporary accounts describe the two cousins as inseparable. They were physically similar, tall, strong, and athletic. They often partnered together in the tilt yard. In the dangerous sport of jousting, trust is paramount. You do not ride alongside a man you doubt. The king trusted Courtenay with his life. In 1521, the king bestowed upon him the ultimate honor. Henry Courtenay was made a Knight of the Garter. This was the highest order of chivalry in England, limited to the sovereign, the Prince of Wales, and 24 companion knights. It was a public declaration that Courtenay was among the elite of the elite. The 1520s represented the zenith of Henry Courtenay's career. He was the ultimate insider. In 1525, his status was elevated even further. The king created him Marquess of Exeter. We must pause to understand the significance of this title. In the Tudor peerage, the rank of Marquess was rare. It sat above an earl and just below a duke. By granting this title, Henry VIII was signaling that Courtenay was second only to the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, and the king himself. With the title came more land and more responsibility. He was granted the manor of West Horsley in Surrey, a magnificent estate that allowed him to be closer to the court in London. He was named a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. This gave him personal access to the king's private living quarters. He was also made constable of Windsor Castle. To an outside observer in 1525, Henry Courtenay appeared untouchable. He had wealth, royal favor, and the correct pedigree. He was married to Gertrude Blount, a woman of sharp intellect and high birth. They were the golden couple of the court. However, beneath the surface of this glittering existence, the tectonic plates of history were beginning to shift. The stability of the Tudor regime depended entirely on the production of a male heir. Queen Catherine of Aragon had failed to provide one. As the 1520s drew to a close, the king's anxiety began to curdle into obsession. The king's great matter, his desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, was about to begin. This political and religious earthquake would force every noble in England to choose a side. For Henry Courtenay, this was the beginning of the end. He stood at the intersection of loyalty to his king and loyalty to the old world that created him. By 1527, the golden age of Henry VIII's court was fading. The jovial camaraderie of the jousting tilt yard was being replaced by the cold calculus of succession. The king had been married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 20 years. She had been a loyal wife and a capable regent, but she had failed in her primary duty to provide a living male heir. The king became convinced that his marriage was cursed, citing Leviticus to argue that marrying his brother's widow had been a sin in the eyes of God. He set his sights on Anne Boleyn, a woman who promised him not just a son, but a new dynasty. This pursuit, known to history as the king's great matter, tore the English nobility apart. It forced men like Henry Courtenay to navigate a landscape where religious duty and political survival were in direct conflict. Henry Courtenay was a man of the old order. His instincts were conservative. He was a cousin to the king, but his sympathies, and certainly those of his family, lay with the traditional Catholic faith and the established hierarchy. However, Courtenay was also a pragmatist. He had seen what happened to those who defied Henry VIII. In 1530, a letter was drafted to Pope Clement VII. It was a petition signed by the peers of England, urging the Pope to grant the king's annulment. The language was stark. If the Pope refused, England might be forced to seek its own remedy. Henry Courtenay, the Marquis of Exeter, signed this letter. To the outside world, this signature was a declaration of loyalty to Henry VIII. It suggested that Courtenay was on board with the king's revolution. But signatures can be deceiving. Courtenay signed because he wanted to preserve his estates and his head. He signed because he was the king's servant. But in the privacy of his own home, a very different political reality was taking shape. While Henry Courtenay walked the tightrope of political neutrality, his wife Gertrude Blount chose a path of dangerous defiance. Gertrude was not merely a passive observer of court politics. She was a formidable player in her own right. She was the daughter of William Blount, Lord Mountjoy, a distinguished scholar and courtier. More importantly, she was a close personal friend of Queen Catherine of Aragon. Gertrude served in the Queen's household and had watched the Princess Mary grow up. Her loyalty to Catherine was absolute. She viewed the rise of Anne Boleyn not just as a political threat, but as a moral abomination. As the king moved to separate England from the authority of Rome, Gertrude became a focal point for the opposition. The Aragonese faction, the group of nobles who supported Queen Catherine, looked to the Courtenay household for leadership. This created a perilous dynamic. Henry Courtenay was the king's cousin and enforcer. His wife was the king's silent enemy. For a time, Courtenay tried to ignore his wife's activities, perhaps hoping that the storm would pass. But in the Tudor police state, silence was not a defense. The tension in the Courtenay household exploded in 1533 with the affair of the Holy Maid of Kent. Elizabeth Barton was a young peasant woman who had gained fame for her religious visions. Initially, these visions were innocuous, but as the king's divorce proceedings accelerated, Barton's prophecies turned treasonous. She began to preach that if Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn, he would cease to be king in the eyes of God within a month. She prophesied his death and damnation. In any other era, Barton might have been dismissed as a fanatic, but in the volatile atmosphere of the 1530s, she became a political weapon. The supporters of Catherine of Aragon flocked to her. Gertrude Courtenay was one of them. The Marchioness of Exeter did not just listen to Barton, she met with her. She traveled to the nunnery where Barton was housed. She did so in disguise, concealing her identity to consult with the prophetess. This was a catastrophic error in judgment. When Thomas Cromwell, the king's new chief minister, moved to crush Barton's circle, he uncovered the list of her patrons. The name of the Marchioness of Exeter was prominent among them. When the Holy Maid of Kent was arrested and interrogated, the extent of Gertrude's involvement was revealed. It was discovered that Gertrude had been in correspondence with the nun. The implications were terrifying. By consulting a woman who prophesied the king's death, Gertrude had technically committed misprision of treason. Henry Courtenay found himself in a nightmare scenario. His wife had handed his enemies a loaded gun. The king was furious. He felt betrayed by his own family. Courtenay did what he had to do to survive. He wrote groveling letters to the king. He distanced himself from his wife's actions, dismissing them as womanly follies and the naivety of a pious woman deceived by a charlatan. he pleaded for the king's mercy, leveraging their lifelong friendship. Henry VIII, perhaps remembering the wrestling matches and the shared youth, chose to be lenient. He accepted Courtenay's apologies. Gertrude was not arrested, though she was forced to write a humiliating letter of submission to the king. They had survived, but the damage was done. The seed of suspicion had been planted in Henry VIII's mind. To understand why Henry VIII felt compelled to destroy Henry Courtenay a few years later, we must look beyond the dry legal charges. The true danger of the Marquis of Exeter lay not in what he did, but in who he was. By the late 1530s, the Tudor court had become a toxic environment. It was ruled by fear, filled with new men, bureaucrats, lawyers, and opportunists like Thomas Cromwell and Richard Rich. It was a place where lineage mattered less than utility to the state. The glamour of the early reign had faded into a grim, utilitarian authoritarianism. In stark contrast, the household of Henry Courtenay represented the old England. At his estates in West Horsley and Tiverton, Courtenay maintained a lifestyle that was dangerously kingly. He kept a massive retinue of servants, retainers, and knights. His hospitality was legendary. While Henry VIII was becoming a recluse, hiding his ulcerated legs and his unpredictable temper behind closed doors, Henry Courtenay was out among the people. He was the embodiment of the chivalric ideal, handsome, athletic, generous, and devout. Historians describe this phenomenon as the existence of a shadow court. The Courtenay household became a magnet for everyone who felt alienated by the changes in London. If you were a scholar who disliked the new religious laws, or a noble who felt snubbed by Cromwell, you gravitated toward the Marquis. Without ever declaring himself a rival, Courtenay became the center of a cultural and social gravity that rivaled the king's own. In the eyes of a narcissist like Henry VIII, this popularity was a theft of the king's glory. This shadow court had a powerful international ally. Eustace Chapuis was the ambassador of the Holy Roman Empire and the eyes and ears of Emperor Charles V in London. He is one of our most vital sources for this period. Chapuis was a brilliant, cynical operator who despised Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cromwell. In his dispatches to the emperor, he frequently mentioned the Courtenays. He identified them as the natural leaders of the Aragonese faction, the supporters of the discarded Queen Catherine. For years, Chapuis cultivated a relationship with the Courtenays. He viewed Henry Courtenay as the alternative king. In secret letters, Chapuis hinted that if the emperor ever decided to invade England to depose the heretic Henry VIII, the people would rally behind Courtenay. There is no evidence that Courtenay ever explicitly agreed to lead a coup. He was too cautious for that. But he did not stop Chapuis from speculating. He allowed himself to be the focus of imperial hope. This was a dangerous game. In the world of international diplomacy, being the favorite of a foreign power was indistinguishable from being a traitor at home. The resistance centered at West Horsley was not just political, it was intellectual and spiritual. Gertrude Courtenay, the Marchioness, was a woman of high education and deep piety. She surrounded herself with the old learning, humanist scholars who remained loyal to the Catholic Church, while the king's court was promoting the radical ideas of the Reformation. The Courtenay household became a sanctuary for traditional theology. They patronized priests who refused to preach the royal supremacy. They possessed books that were becoming dangerous to own. This intellectual circle was arguably more threatening to Thomas Cromwell than any army. Cromwell was trying to change the mind of England, to rewrite its history and theology. The Courtenays were keeping the old memory alive. They were preserving the culture that Cromwell was trying to delete. Perhaps the most provocative aspect of the Courtenay household was the upbringing of their son, Edward. Henry VIII's own nursery was a place of tragedy and anxiety. He had only one legitimate son, Prince Edward, born late in his life. The succession always felt fragile. In contrast, the Courtenays had a healthy, vibrant heir. Young Edward Courtenay was raised with an education that befitted a prince. He was taught rhetoric, languages, and music. He was conscious of his royal Yorkist blood from an early age. There is a psychological element here that cannot be ignored. Henry VIII looked at his cousin's family and saw everything he wanted for himself: a healthy heir, a loyal wife, and the adoration of the people. The destruction of the Courtenays was in part an act of supreme envy. The king smashed the mirror because the reflection it cast was more beautiful than the reality of his own life. To understand the fall of Henry Courtenay, one must also understand his nemesis, Thomas Cromwell. History rarely produces two men more different than Courtenay and Cromwell. Courtenay was born into the purple. He was a man of the sword, of land, and of ancient blood. He believed in the feudal order where the king ruled as the first among equals, supported by his noble cousins. Thomas Cromwell was the son of a blacksmith from Putney. He had no bloodline. He had no estates. He had risen through sheer intellect, ruthless efficiency, and a mastery of the law. Cromwell represented the new state. He envisioned a centralized monarchy where the king's power was absolute, unhindered by the Pope or the old nobility. Cromwell viewed men like Courtenay as dinosaurs. They were relics of a past that needed to be swept away. More specifically, Cromwell viewed Courtenay as a threat to the Reformation. As Cromwell dismantled the monasteries and reorganized the Church of England, he knew that the conservative people of the West Country were seething with resentment. They looked to their natural leader, the Marquis of Exeter, to stop the changes. Courtenay hated Cromwell. He viewed the minister as an upstart and a knave. There are reports of Courtenay threatening Cromwell, expressing a desire to see him removed. But Courtenay underestimated his opponent. While the Marquis relied on his royal blood for protection, Cromwell relied on his network of spies. The execution of Anne Boleyn in 1536 offered a brief moment of hope for the Courtenays. With the concubine dead and Princess Elizabeth declared illegitimate, it seemed that the old order might be restored. Gertrude Courtenay rushed to reconcile with the king. She served as a calm, maternal figure to the Princess Mary, helping the king's eldest daughter navigate the treacherous return to court favor. For a moment, it seemed that the Courtenays had weathered the storm. Henry VIII married Jane Seymour, a woman of conservative sympathies who was friendly with the old nobility. But the relief was an illusion. The machinery of the Tudor state had changed permanently. The dissolution of the monasteries was accelerating. The wealth of the church was being funneled into the royal treasury. The social fabric of England was tearing. In late 1536, the north of England erupted. The Pilgrimage of Grace was the largest popular rebellion in English history. 30,000 men marched to defend their faith and demand the dismissal of Thomas Cromwell. Henry VIII was terrified. He needed generals. He turned to his cousin, Henry Courtenay. The king ordered Courtenay to lead forces against the rebels. This was the ultimate test of loyalty. Courtenay was being asked to destroy men who were fighting for the very principles his wife held dear. He was being asked to crush a rebellion that many believed he secretly supported. Courtenay obeyed. He marched, but he did not fight with the zeal the king expected. Reports filtered back to London that the Marquis was unenthusiastic. He was accused of being slack. In the eyes of Henry VIII, a lack of enthusiasm was indistinguishable from treason. The rebellion was crushed, but the king's trust in his cousin never fully recovered. Henry VIII now saw enemies everywhere. He looked at the Plantagenet bloodline, the Courtenays and the Poles, and he no longer saw cousins. He saw challengers. The stage was set for the final act. The year 1538 would bring the Exeter conspiracy, a murky and manufactured plot that would finally give Cromwell the excuse he needed to destroy the White Rose forever. By 1538, the atmosphere in England was brittle. The optimism of the early Tudor years had vanished, replaced by a pervasive sense of dread. The king was 47 years old, but he was an old man in a decaying body. The athletic prince who had once wrestled with Courtenay was gone. In his place was a colossal, immobile figure, plagued by chronic pain. An ulcer on his leg, likely the result of a jousting accident years prior, refused to heal. It oozed and throbbed, causing the king bouts of fever and violent mood swings. But his physical pain was secondary to his political terror. Although he finally had a son, Prince Edward, born in 1537, the boy was an infant. Tudor mortality rates were high. A single fever could wipe out the dynasty. If Henry died while Edward was still a child, England would be plunged into a minority rule, a recipe for civil war. Externally, the situation was equally dire. The two great powers of Europe, France and the Holy Roman Empire, had signed the Treaty of Nice, ending their long war. For years, Henry had played them against each other. Now they were united, and the Pope was urging them to launch a crusade against the heretic King of England. Henry VIII felt encircled. He saw enemies across the Channel and traitors within his own court. He became convinced that the remnants of the House of York, the White Rose, were plotting to overthrow him and replace his infant son with one of their own. His gaze settled on two families, the Poles and the Courtenays. The catalyst for the tragedy was not in England, but in Italy. Cardinal Reginald Pole was a cousin to both Henry VIII and Henry Courtenay. He was a man of immense intellect and piety who had once been a favorite of the king. Henry had paid for Pole's education, hoping he would become a staunch defender of the Tudor Church. Instead, Reginald Pole became its harshest critic. From the safety of exile in Italy, he wrote a treatise titled Pro Ecclesiasticae Unitatis Defensione, Defense of the Unity of the Church. It was a devastating attack on Henry VIII's character and his claim to be supreme head of the church. Pole compared the king to the biblical tyrant Pharaoh and urged the people of England to repent. Henry VIII was apoplectic. He demanded Pole's return to England to face justice. Pole, knowing this meant death, refused. The king sent assassins to Italy to kill him. They failed. Powerless to reach the man himself, Henry's fury turned inward. If he could not strike Reginald, he would strike those he loved. He would destroy the network of families that supported the old faith. In Henry's mind, Reginald Pole was the external threat, and Henry Courtenay was the internal weapon, the sword waiting to be drawn. Thomas Cromwell, ever the efficient servant, understood his master's mood. He knew the king wanted the Yorkist faction destroyed, but Cromwell needed evidence. Henry Courtenay was a powerful man, popular in the West Country and beloved by the people. He could not simply be executed without cause. A case had to be built. Cromwell found his opening in the person of Sir Geoffrey Pole. Geoffrey was the younger brother of Reginald Pole and Lord Montague. He was a nervous, unstable man who lacked the fortitude of his siblings. In August 1538, Cromwell had Geoffrey arrested and thrown into the Tower of London. We do not know exactly what happened in the darkness of Geoffrey's cell. Tudor interrogations were psychological and physical ordeals. He was likely told that his family was already doomed. He may have been shown the rack. Broken by fear and the promise of a pardon, Geoffrey turned on his own blood. He began to talk. He provided Cromwell with names, dates, and conversations. He implicated his brother Lord Montague. Crucially, he implicated the Marquis of Exeter. The Exeter conspiracy, as it came to be known, was a nebulous affair. Unlike later plots in English history, there was no gunpowder, no stockpiled weapons, and no battle plans. The conspiracy consisted entirely of words, whispers, grumbles, and shared confidences. Geoffrey Pole claimed that Henry Courtenay and Lord Montague had maintained a secret correspondence with the exiled Reginald Pole. In the Tudor definition of treason, communicating with a declared enemy of the state was a capital offense. But the accusations went deeper. Cromwell's agents began to interview servants in the Courtenay household. They were looking for evidence of malicious intent. They found that Courtenay had been reckless with his tongue. Witnesses claimed that during the Pilgrimage of Grace, Courtenay had expressed sympathy for the rebels. Others claimed that he sang political songs that mocked the king's advisors. One particularly damaging witness statement alleged that Courtenay had said, "I trust once to have a fair day upon the knaves that rule about the king, and I trust to see a merry world one day." To a modern ear, this sounds like the grumbling of a frustrated politician. He was complaining about knaves, specifically Cromwell, not the king, but under the treason laws of 1538. Imagining the king's death or predicting a time after the king's reign was treason. To speak of a merry world in the future implied that the current world, the king's world, was not merry. It implied a desire for change. Cromwell needed something tangible, a physical object that the jury could see. He sent his agents to search West Horsley Place, Courtenay's primary residence. They ransacked the house. In a cupboard, presumably tucked away and forgotten, they found a standard, a heraldic flag. It was made of tin, likely a model or a draft for a ceremonial display. The standard depicted the royal arms of England quartered with the arms of the Courtenay family. Heraldry was a serious language in the 16th century. By quartering his arms with the royal arms, Courtenay was asserting his descent from Edward IV. This was his birthright. His mother was a princess of York. He was entitled to bear these arms. He had displayed them openly for years without issue. But Cromwell twisted the narrative. He argued that the discovery of this flag, hidden in a cupboard, was proof that Henry Courtenay regarded himself as the rightful king. He argued that Courtenay was keeping the flag ready for the moment Henry VIII died, planning to unfurl it and declare himself sovereign. It was a distortion of the truth, but it was effective. It painted Courtenay not just as a dissatisfied noble, but as a usurper in waiting. By November 1538, the dossier was complete. The king was satisfied. The order was given. On November 4th, the blow fell. Henry Courtenay was at his estates, likely aware that the net was closing. He was arrested along with his wife Gertrude. At the same time, in other parts of the country, Lord Montague and his mother, the elderly Countess of Salisbury, Reginald Pole's mother, were also detained. The fall was absolute. One moment Courtenay was the Marquis of Exeter, a cousin of the king, living in princely luxury. The next, he was a prisoner of state. He was transported to the Tower of London. He passed through the Traitor's Gate, the water entrance that had swallowed so many of the king's enemies, Thomas More, John Fisher, Anne Boleyn. Courtenay was placed in a cell, isolated from his friends and family. His wife Gertrude was held in a separate part of the fortress. Their son Edward, only 12 years old, was also in prison. The king was taking no chances. He was rooting out the entire line. For Henry Courtenay, sitting in the cold stone damp of the tower, the bitter irony must have been overwhelming. He had spent his life being careful. He had signed the letters he was told to sign. He had suppressed the rebels he was told to suppress. He had wrestled with the king and called him brother. but he had committed the one sin that could not be absolved. He was a Plantagenet in a Tudor world. The blood that had once been his glory was now his death warrant. The trap had been sprung, the arrests made, and the evidence of the tin flag secured. Now, the machinery of the Tudor state shifted from investigation to condemnation. For Henry Courtenay, the silence of the Tower cell was merely the prelude to a public spectacle. He was about to face a trial where the verdict was written before the charges were even read, in a hall where justice bowed to the will of the king. December 1538 was a bitterly cold month in London. The Thames was gray and swollen, and the mood in the capital was grim. On December 3rd, the doors of Westminster Hall were thrown open for the trial of Henry Courtenay. Westminster Hall was the heart of English law. It was a cavernous space with a magnificent hammer beam roof, a place designed to make individuals feel small in the presence of the state. For centuries, it had witnessed the trials of the great and the good. Now, it would witness the destruction of the king's cousin. The trial was not a fact-finding mission. It was a formality. In Tudor treason trials, the conviction rate was effectively 100%. The accused was not allowed defense counsel. He was not shown the evidence beforehand. He could not call witnesses to speak against the crown. He stood alone, armed only with his wits, against the full machinery of the government. Presiding over the court was Sir Thomas Audley, the Lord Chancellor, sitting as the Lord High Steward. But the true judges were Courtenay's peers. A panel of nobles had been assembled to deliver the verdict. These were men Courtenay had known all his life, men like the Duke of Suffolk and the Earl of Hertford. The tragedy of the situation was palpable. These peers were not impartial jurors. They were terrified men. They knew that Thomas Cromwell was watching. They knew that Henry VIII was waiting for a guilty verdict. To acquit Henry Courtenay would be to declare oneself an enemy of the king. They were there to save their own skins by condemning their friend. When Courtenay was brought to the bar, he appeared haggard but composed. The months of anxiety and the weeks in the Tower had taken their toll, yet he remained a marquis, carrying the dignity of his bloodline. The indictment was read aloud. The charges were a mixture of hearsay and twisted facts. He was accused of traitorously machinating the king's destruction. He was charged with adhering to the king's enemy, Reginald Pole. The statement about trusting to see a merry world one day was read out as proof of his seditious intent. Cromwell's prosecutors painted a picture of a vast, sprawling conspiracy. They alleged that Courtenay and Lord Montague had planned to rise up, kill the king, and place Reginald Pole on the throne, or perhaps Courtenay himself. The tin flag found at West Horsley was presented as a damning totem of his ambition. Courtenay defended himself with vigor. He denied the charges categorically. He argued that the evidence was nothing more than the malicious gossip of servants and the forced confessions of a broken man, Geoffrey Pole. He pointed out that he had never raised a sword against the king. He had never gathered troops. He had never sought foreign aid. But logic had no place in Westminster Hall that day. The law stated that treason was in the intent, not just the deed. If the king believed Courtenay intended him harm, that was enough. The peers retired to consider their verdict. It did not take long. When they returned, the foreman pronounced the inevitable word, guilty. Sir Thomas Audley pronounced the sentence. It was the standard penalty for high treason, the most gruesome punishment in English law. Henry Courtenay was sentenced to be returned to the Tower, and from there to be drawn on a hurdle to Tyburn, where he would be hanged, cut down while still alive, his bowels removed and burned before his eyes, and his body quartered. Courtenay listened to the sentence without breaking. He knew the game was lost. However, shortly after the trial, the king granted a final grim act of mercy. Because of Courtenay's royal blood, Because they shared a grandfather in Edward IV, the sentence was commuted. He would not suffer the butchery of hanging and quartering. He would be beheaded. The date was set for December 9th, 1538. The execution would take place on Tower Hill, the public execution site just outside the walls of the fortress. That morning, 3 men were led out of the tower: Henry Courtenay, Henry Pole, Lord Montague, and Sir Edward Neville, another conservative knight caught in the dragnet. A large crowd had gathered. Public executions were a spectator sport in Tudor London. But this one was different. The crowd was not jeering. These were popular men. The Courtenays were the old nobility, the traditional landlords, who were far more beloved than the new bureaucratic men like Cromwell. There was a somber, shocked atmosphere as the Marquis ascended the scaffold. We do not have a transcript of Courtenay's final speech. Convention dictated that the condemned confess their sins and acknowledge the king's justice, regardless of their innocence. To speak out against the king on the scaffold was to risk the king's wrath falling on the family left behind. Courtenay had a wife and a 12-year-old son still locked in the tower. For their sake, he had to die well. He would have knelt in the straw, perhaps reciting a final prayer in Latin. He was a devout Catholic, and in his final moments he likely found solace in the faith that the king was trying to dismantle. The executioner did his work. The axe fell. In a single violent instant, the life of the king's cousin, the man who had been the alternative king, was extinguished. The death of the man was only the beginning of the destruction. The legal mechanism of attainder followed swiftly. Parliament passed an Act of Attainder against Henry Courtenay. This meant that in the eyes of the law, his blood was corrupted. He was posthumously stripped of all his titles. The Marquisate of Exeter and the Earldom of Devon ceased to exist. His vast estates, the manors in Surrey, the castles in Devon, the thousands of acres of farmland, were forfeited to the crown. Henry VIII absorbed the Courtenay wealth with voracious speed. The power base that had ruled the West Country for centuries was dismantled overnight. The king's agents moved in to collect rents and evict loyal retainers. In the days following the execution of Henry Courtenay, a terrifying silence descended upon the English court. Henry VIII had done the unthinkable. He had spilled his own blood. He had executed a man who was not only his cousin, but his lifelong friend. If the court expected the king to show remorse, they were mistaken. Henry VIII had crossed a psychological Rubicon. Having convinced himself that Courtenay was a traitor, the king erased him from his memory with chilling efficiency. The name Exeter was never to be spoken in his presence again. The king moved swiftly to consolidate his victory. He sent commissioners to the West Country to dismantle the Courtenay power base. They tore down the Courtenay arms from public buildings. They shattered the stained glass windows that bore the family crest. It was a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. The goal was to make the people of Devon forget that the Courtenays had ever ruled them. While the lawyers and peers would debate the legal status of the earldom centuries later, the immediate aftermath of the Courtenay downfall was felt most acutely in the fields and villages of Devon. The people there didn't need a patent of nobility to know who their leaders were. When the crown tried to replace the good lord with foreign mercenaries and new laws, the simmering resentment of the West Country boiled over, proving that you can kill a man, but you cannot easily kill a loyalty etched into the soul of a region. To fully comprehend the tragedy of Henry Courtenay, we must look beyond the scaffold at Tower Hill and turn our gaze to the lands he left behind. In the 16th century, a great nobleman was not merely a landlord collecting rents. He was the sun around which the local society orbited. He was the good lord, the guarantor of justice, the protector of the poor, and the voice of the county in London. For centuries, the Courtenay family had been the uncrowned kings of Devon and Cornwall. They understood the unique culture of the West Country, a rugged, independent region with its own dialect and a fierce suspicion of outsiders. When Henry VIII executed the Marquis of Exeter and confiscated his estates, he created a catastrophic power vacuum. The king replaced the ancient, organic authority of the Courtenays with the cold, bureaucratic hand of the state. He appointed new men, administrators like Lord John Russell, to govern the region. Russell was a capable man, but to the people of Devon, he was a foreigner. He did not know their ways. He did not share their blood. He was simply an agent of a distant, greedy crown that had murdered their natural leader. The resentment simmered for a decade, waiting for a spark. That spark came in 1549, 11 years after Henry Courtenay's execution. Henry VIII was dead, and his sickly son, Edward VI, was on the throne. The government, led by the radical Protestant Duke of Somerset, decided to ban the Latin Mass and impose a new English book of common prayer. For the conservative people of the West Country, this was the final insult. They had lost their good Lord, and now they were losing their God. In June 1549, the region exploded. This was not a riot. It was a full-scale civil war known as the Prayer Book Rebellion, or the Western Rising. Thousands of commoners, farmers, fishermen, and tin miners armed themselves with pitchforks and old bills. They seized the city of Exeter and laid siege to the new gentry. What makes this rebellion central to our story is the list of demands the rebels sent to the king. Amongst the religious requests, the restoration of the Latin Mass, the return of holy water, was a political demand that terrified the government. The rebels demanded that Edward Courtenay be released from the Tower of London. Even though Henry Courtenay had been dead for a decade and his son had been locked away since childhood, the people of the West had not forgotten. They believed that if a Courtenay were restored to his rightful place at Tiverton Castle, order would return. They viewed the young prisoner in the Tower not as a traitor, but as their legitimate governor. This demand proves that Henry VIII's attempt to erase the Courtenay name had failed. He had killed the man, but he could not kill the loyalty. The ghost of the Marquis of Exeter was leading an army from the grave. The government's response was brutal. Because there was no Henry Courtenay to mediate, no respected noble who could ride out and talk the rebels down, the crown sent foreign mercenaries. Lord Russell, the man who had replaced the Courtenays, led an army of German and Italian mercenaries into Devon. These professional soldiers had no qualms about killing English peasants. The result was a massacre. At the Battle of Clyst, St. Mary, and the subsequent slaughter at Clyst Heath, thousands of Devonshire men were butchered. The rebel priests were hanged from their own church towers. The countryside was torched. Historians often speculate on the what if. Had Henry Courtenay been alive and in the king's favor, he likely could have prevented the uprising or negotiated a peaceful settlement. His execution removed the safety valve of the West. The slaughter of 1549 was a direct, delayed casualty of the axe that fell in 1538. To see the physical scars of this history, one must visit Tiverton Castle in Devon. This was the primary seat of the Courtenay power. In its prime under Henry Courtenay, it was a bustling administrative hub and a luxurious palace. After the attainder, it fell into a slow, melancholy decay. The great halls, where Henry Courtenay had feasted with the local gentry, fell silent. The deer parks were neglected. The stone walls, once a symbol of protection for the local people, became a symbol of the crown's tyranny. Today, Tiverton Castle still stands, partially ruined, partially inhabited. It is a haunting monument to the lost court. Visitors often report a heavy atmosphere in the medieval parts of the structure, a sense of a story that was violently interrupted. The ferocity of this rebellion in 1549 serves as the ultimate retrospective proof of Henry VIII's fears. It demonstrates that the power Henry Courtenay wielded was not imaginary. It was visceral and dangerous. The shadow court that Cromwell destroyed had deep roots, but the king's paranoia was not satiated by one death. The execution of Henry Courtenay was merely the opening salvo in a purge that would last for years. The horror of the Exeter conspiracy reached its zenith not with a man, but with an old woman. Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, was the mother of the Pole brothers and a close ally of the Courtenays. She was the last surviving member of the Plantagenet dynasty who had been born before the Tudors took the throne. She was nearly 70 years old, frail, and innocent of any crime other than being Reginald Pole's mother. Henry VIII kept her in the Tower for 2 years after Courtenay's death. He stripped her of her lands and titles. Then, in 1541, in an act of petty vindictiveness that shocked Europe, he ordered her execution. Her death was a butchery. The inexperienced executioner hacked at her shoulders and head in a gruesome display. It was the final bloody punctuation mark to the story that began with Henry Courtenay's arrest. It proved that the king's fury knew no bounds of age, gender, or kinship. Gertrude Courtenay, the Marchioness of Exeter, remained in the Tower. She had been the firebrand, the supporter of the Holy Maid of Kent, the woman whose folly had drawn the king's eye. Now she was a widow and a pauper. However, Gertrude possessed a survivor's instinct. She understood that her only hope lay in absolute submission. From her cell she wrote letters to the king, begging for forgiveness, acknowledging her husband's treasons, whether she believed them or not, and throwing herself on the king's mercy. Henry VIII, unpredictable as ever, decided to spare her. Perhaps he felt that without her husband and her wealth, she was no longer a threat. In 1540, Gertrude was granted a pardon and released. She emerged from the Tower into a world that had changed. She was no longer the chatelaine of West Horsley Place. She was a woman of modest means, living on a small portion of her former dower lands. She spent the rest of Henry VIII's reign in quiet obscurity, a living ghost of the old court, waiting for the day the tyrant would die. While Gertrude walked free, the true tragedy of the Courtenay legacy was unfolding behind the stone walls she had left. Edward Courtenay, the son of Henry and Gertrude, remained a prisoner. Edward's story is one of the most poignant in Tudor history. He entered the Tower as a child of 12, a boy who loved music and hawking. He would not leave until he was 26. His entire adolescence was stolen. While other young noblemen were learning to joust, dance, and court women, Edward was staring at the same patch of sky through a barred window. He was the man in the iron mask of the Tudor dynasty. The king ordered that Edward be treated relatively well. He was given a tutor and allowed books, but he was strictly forbidden from communicating with the outside world. He grew up in a vacuum. He became a scholar, translating Italian works and mastering the lute, but he was socially stunted, a man who knew the world only through books. Edward was the vessel of the White Rose claim. As long as Henry VIII lived, and as long as his son Edward VI lived, Edward Courtenay was too dangerous to be free. He was the backup king, kept in storage, just in case the Tudors failed. There is a grim irony in the aftermath of Henry Courtenay's death. The man who engineered it, Thomas Cromwell, did not enjoy his victory for long. Cromwell had destroyed the Courtenays to secure his own position and to advance the Reformation, but by removing the conservative counterbalance in the court, Cromwell left himself exposed. When he arranged the king's disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves in 1540, he lost the king's favor. The Duke of Norfolk, a peer who had sat in judgment of Henry Courtenay, turned on Cromwell. In July 1540, just 18 months after Courtenay's execution, Thomas Cromwell climbed the same scaffold on Tower Hill. He died by the same axe. The shark tank of the Tudor court had claimed the predator just as it had claimed the prey. Henry Courtenay, if he was watching from the afterlife, might have found a bitter satisfaction in seeing his destroyer fall. The execution of Henry Courtenay marked a definitive turning point in the reign of Henry VIII. Before 1538, there was still a semblance of the old chivalric order. The king was surrounded by men he had known since youth. After 1538, Henry VIII was alone. He had killed the last of his contemporaries. The court became a place of young, hungry men who feared the king rather than loved him. The merry world that Courtenay had supposedly longed for was gone forever. The king grew sicker, fatter, and more tyrannical. He died in 1547, leaving behind a child heir and a fractured kingdom. For 15 years, the name Courtenay was whispered only in fear, but in 1553 the wheel of fortune turned once more. Edward VI, the boy king, died. After a brief struggle, Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, swept to power. Mary I was the woman Gertrude Courtenay had championed. She was the Catholic queen the Courtenays had prayed for. On her entry into London, one of Mary's first acts was to go to the Tower of London. There, kneeling on the green, were the state prisoners of her father's reign. Among them was a tall, handsome, pale young man who had not seen liberty since he was 12 years old. Queen Mary raised Edward Courtenay from his knees. She kissed him. She ordered his immediate release. She restored the earldom of Devon. The Courtenay story seemed poised for a miraculous resurrection. The son had survived the father's curse. There was even talk that the queen might marry him, uniting the Tudors and the House of York once and for all. But the happy ending was an illusion. The prison doors were finally opening, yet the tragedy was far from over. As Edward Courtenay stepped out into the blinding light of freedom, he was not merely walking out of a cell. He was walking into a world that had moved on without him. The crowds that cheered his release saw a symbol of resurrection. The handsome Plantagenet prince returned to save them. They did not see the reality. A man whose growth had been frozen in time. The physical chains were struck off, but the psychological scars of 15 years in silence would prove far harder to break. He was a man of 26 with the social experience of a child, thrust into the most dangerous viper's nest in Europe. Upon his release, he tried to make up for lost time with a desperate, reckless intensity. He plunged into the debauchery of London. He frequented brothels and drank heavily, behavior that scandalized the pious Queen Mary. The court had expected a saintly martyr. They got a wild, unstable young man desperate to feel alive. Despite his erratic behavior, Edward Courtenay was the most eligible bachelor in the kingdom. The English public and Parliament were desperate for Queen Mary to marry an Englishman. They feared that a foreign marriage would turn England into a vassal state of Spain or France. Courtenay was the obvious choice. He was a Plantagenet. Marrying him would unite the Tudor and Yorkist lines, cementing Mary's claim and healing the wounds of the past. For a brief moment, it seemed that the son of the executed Henry Courtenay would become king consort of England. But Mary was not interested. She was 37, 11 years older than Courtenay. She viewed him as a child, and a dissolute one at that. She had her eyes set on a different prize, Prince Philip of Spain, the son of Emperor Charles V. Philip was Catholic, powerful, and represented the grand alliance Mary craved. When Mary announced her intention to marry Philip, the court fractured. The Spanish match was deeply unpopular. Xenophobia ran high in London. The people did not want a Spanish king. They wanted Courtenay. In the winter of 1553 to 1554, dissatisfaction turned into conspiracy. A group of Kentish landowners, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, plotted to overthrow Queen Mary before Philip could arrive. Their plan was explosive. They intended to depose Mary and place her younger half-sister, the Princess Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I, on the throne. To secure the succession and the loyalty of the old nobility, they planned to marry Elizabeth to Edward Courtenay. It is unclear how much Courtenay knew of the plot. He was a weak, impressionable man, easily manipulated by stronger personalities. He certainly met with the conspirators. He likely listened to their whispers that he could be king, not merely a consort, but a ruler. However, when the rebellion began to crumble, Courtenay panicked. He lacked the steel of his father. Under questioning by the Lord Chancellor, Stephen Gardiner, Courtenay broke. He confessed his knowledge of the plot, implicating the others to save himself. Wyatt's rebellion failed. Wyatt was executed. Queen Mary was furious, not just at the rebels, but at the cousin she had shown mercy to only months before. For the second time in his life, Edward Courtenay was arrested. In February 1554, he was sent back to the Tower of London. The psychological horror of this return is difficult to imagine. After tasting freedom for barely 6 months, the gates closed on him again. He was placed in the bell tower, not far from where his father had spent his final days. Mary faced pressure to execute him. The Spanish ambassadors urged her to clear the board before Philip arrived. They argued that as long as Courtenay lived, he would be a figurehead for rebellion. But Mary could not bring herself to kill him. Perhaps she remembered his youth, or perhaps she felt that executing the last male of the House of York would be one sin too many. Instead of the axe, she chose exile. In 1555, Edward Courtenay was released from the Tower and banished from England. He was sent to Italy, ostensibly to study, but in reality to die in obscurity. He traveled to Venice and then to Padua, a driftless, broken man. The end came swiftly and mysteriously. In September 1556, just a year into his exile, Edward Courtenay fell ill in Padua. He had been hawking in the rain and developed a fever. However, rumors of poison swirled immediately. The Venetian ambassador reported that Courtenay believed he had been poisoned. Some pointed the finger at agents of the Spanish, who still viewed him as a threat to Philip's rule in England. Others suggested it was simply the weak constitution of a man who had spent his life in a damp cell. He died on September 18, 1556. He was roughly 30 years old. He died alone, thousands of miles from the West Country estates that should have been his inheritance. With his death, the senior male line of the Courtenay family was extinguished. The descendants of the White Rose, the alternative kings of England, were gone. The story of Henry Courtenay, Marquis of Exeter, and his son Edward is a microcosm of the Tudor century. It is a story of how a dynasty secured its power, not just through marriage and war, but through the systematic elimination of alternatives. When a man is erased from history by the state, often the only evidence of his existence is what he scratched into stone with his own hands. For the documentary filmmaker or the historian, the physical legacy of the Courtenays is not found in statues or grand tombs, but in the dark corners of the Tower of London. If you visit the tower today, specifically the Beauchamp Tower, where high-ranking prisoners were often held, you can find the physical traces of Edward Courtenay's lost youth. During his years of solitary confinement, Edward took a nail or a knife and carved his thoughts into the soft stone walls. These are not merely names, they are cries of anguish frozen in time. One inscription attributed to him reads, The more I seek to have liberty, the further I am from my desire. It is a chilling summary of his life. Another carving depicts a cut rose, a symbol of his destroyed family, the White Rose of York. These etchings are the most intimate connection we have to the family. They remind us that the Exeter conspiracy was not just a political event in a textbook. It was a human tragedy that involved years of staring at the same four walls, wondering if the executioner was coming in the morning. While Edward rotted in the Tower, the king enjoyed the spoils of his father's treason. The Courtenay family home, West Horsley Place in Surrey, became a favorite retreat for Henry VIII. There's a grotesque irony in the records of 1539, the year after Henry Courtenay's beheading. The king visited West Horsley Place for a grand lunch. He dined in the very hall where Courtenay had once entertained him as a friend. The king brought his own court, his own musicians, and his own wine. While the king feasted on the spoils of the father and the son rotted in exile, the legal entity of the family appeared to die with them. With the last breath of the exile in Padua, the active threat to the Tudor throne was finally gone. To the observers of the 16th century, the tragedy was complete. The line was broken, the estates partitioned, and the great earldom of Devon erased from the map. However, a strange legal anomaly lay buried in the dusty archives of the state, a time bomb of nobility that would not explode for nearly 3 centuries. The patent granted by Queen Mary contained a linguistic peculiarity that went unnoticed by the Tudor lawyers, a detail that would allow the Courtenay name to achieve a resurrection that Edward himself never found. When Queen Mary restored Edward Courtenay in 1553, the patent, the legal document granting the title, used unusual wording. Instead of granting the earldom to him and the heirs male of his body, his sons, it granted it to him and his heirs male forever. This distinction is crucial. Heirs male of his body restricts the title to direct descendants. Heirs male is much broader. It includes brothers, uncles, and distant cousins. Because Edward died unmarried and childless, everyone assumed the title died with him. For 275 years, the earldom of Devon remained dormant. No one claimed it. The title was considered extinct. While Henry Courtenay's branch of the family, the Courtenays of Tiverton, rose to dizzying heights and fell to the executioner's axe, a junior branch of the family had been living quietly in Devon. These were the Courtenays of Powderham Castle. They were distant cousins to Henry the Marquess. They were not royal. They did not have the White Rose blood. Because of this, they survived. While Henry VIII was purging the royal cousins, the Powderham Courtenays kept their heads down, managed their estates, and served as local sheriffs. They played the long game. For centuries, they lived as simple country gentry and later as viscounts, unaware that they technically held one of the oldest and most prestigious earldoms in England. In the 19th century, a genealogical curiosity turned into a high-profile legal battle. William Courtenay, the heir of the Powderham branch, discovered the wording of the 1553 patent. He realized that because he was a direct male descendant of the original Courtenay stock, the title should technically have passed to his family in 1556. He petitioned the House of Lords. It was a sensation. The case argued that for nearly 3 centuries, there had been a phantom earldom waiting to be claimed. In 1831, the House of Lords ruled in his favor. They declared that the earldom of Devon had never gone extinct. It had simply been asleep. The title was revived, and the Courtenays of Powderham became the Earls of Devon. This legal victory served as a strange posthumous vindication for the executed Marquess. His bloodline was gone, but his name survived. The earldom of Devon exists to this day, Held by the Courtenay family at Powderham Castle, it is the only title in the English peerage that survived the purge of the White Rose, a testament to the endurance of the family name. As we look back from the 21st century, how does history judge Henry Courtenay? For centuries, the Tudor narrative prevailed. History books written under Elizabeth I painted the Courtenays as treacherous schemers who got what they deserved. They were depicted as stubborn reactionaries who tried to hold back the glorious Protestant Reformation. Even William Shakespeare, the great dramatist of the age, avoided the subject. In his play Henry VIII, the complexities of the Exeter conspiracy are ghosted. To tell Courtenay's story honestly on the Elizabethan stage would have been impossible. It would have required admitting that the Queen's father was a tyrant who murdered his closest friends to soothe his own paranoia. However, modern historians such as G.R. Elton and J.J. Scarisbrick have dismantled this view. The consensus today is that the Exeter conspiracy was largely a fabrication. Historians now view Henry Courtenay not as a conspirator, but as a conservative pragmatist. He did not want to overthrow the king. He simply wanted the world to stop changing so fast. He wanted the monasteries to remain. He wanted his wife to be safe. He wanted to drink wine with his cousin the king, as they had done in their youth. His death is now cited as the prime example of the tyranny of Henry VIII's later years. It proves that by 1538, the rule of law in England had collapsed completely, replaced by the rule of the king's paranoia. The story of Henry Courtenay is a tragedy of proximity. In the solar system of the Tudor court, Henry VIII was the sun. To be far away was to freeze in obscurity. To be too close was to burn. Courtenay's life offers a warning about the nature of authoritarian power. He did everything right. He was loyal, he was noble, and he was popular. But in a system built on one man's ego, popularity is a crime. When the axe fell on Tower Hill in 1538, it did not just kill a man. It killed the medieval idea of kingship, the idea that the king was supported by a brotherhood of nobles. It ushered in the modern idea of the absolute state, where the monarch stands alone and everyone else is merely a subject. Henry Courtenay was the last of the old world. He stood on the scaffold, looked out at the city of London, and perhaps realized that the merry world he longed for was already gone. He was a ghost before he even died, but his legacy survives in the endurance of the name. The Earldom of Devon, revived by the House of Lords in 1831, continues to this day. The Courtenay family still lives at Powderham Castle overlooking the estuary. They are the survivors. They outlasted the Tudors. They outlasted the Stuarts. They outlasted the British Empire itself. In the end, perhaps that is the ultimate victory. Henry VIII tried to erase them from the earth. To pull up the root and branch, he failed. The king is dead, his dynasty is extinct, but the Courtenays remain, a living link to the Plantagenet past and a silent reminder of the man who stood too close to the sun.